Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. The War Bride's Oath. Episode 10. The king remained silent for a little while. A part of him was still desperate to protect her at any cost. Since he had learned what she had gone through after he left, and what had happened to her dragon, Ashen felt an even bigger sense of responsibility toward Cecilia. In his mind, he had already been granted a miracle just to be able to meet her once more and to have her by his side. But if anything happened to her because of this kingdom's political intrigues, it would be entirely his fault. While he was lost in some dark thoughts, the princess unexpectedly slipped her hand into his. He glanced down, a bit surprised, but Cecilia looked very calm, simply leading their little stroll away from his childhood house. He held her hand a bit tighter and they kept walking in silence, just enjoying each other's presence, and the quiet streets around them. With no one willing to stay out late, it looked as if time had stopped in the streets of the capital. The night sky was beautiful too. The moon was bright and full, only obscured once in a while by a lonely cloud. "I really like this city," she whispered. "It wasn't always this calm and quiet. 10 years ago, you couldn't walk 3 streets without risking being robbed or getting into a fight. The wealthier people hid in their houses and could pay for their security, but for everyone else, it was quite the challenge just to survive." Nana told us about her childhood here too. Yet, she probably experienced it from a more privileged point of view. At the very least, the clans, even if they were still more tribes back then, could protect each other. For people with only their families to rely on, it was hard. Cecilia nodded, and they kept walking. Knowing the history of this place made her even prouder about what Ashen had managed to do with it. Bringing back peace and security had probably been the very first step to healing this country from its deep wounds. Even if it was just beginning with the capital, it could at least show that with time and the proper measures and leaders, the other cities would improve too. It was just a matter of time, and if they could find the right people. "What about Councillor Yasim?" Cecilia asked. "I heard a bit from him about his relationship with you, but..." Ashen grimaced a bit. "He told you he used to be my teacher?" "Yes. He was also my father's way of watching me. For as long as I stayed in the castle, Yasim would be stuck to me. On the surface, he did teach me a lot of things, and gave me an education, but he also reported every single one of my movements to my father. I never really knew which side he stood on, and while I grew under his watch, I felt like this cunning old man was watching me as much as my father was. He was grooming me to become the perfect prince. I had one of the sharpest educations thanks to him, and I caught up on everything in a matter of months under his teachings. My mother had taught me the basics of how to read, calculate, and write, but Yasim took me to the level of this kingdom's scholars. For this, at least, I am grateful to him." "Was he ever strict?" "Yes. But he wasn't inflexible, or too rude. At times, he was even the one to suggest I go back to the field, to take a break from my studies. It was as if he knew exactly which point he could push me to before I'd really give up, or get mad. At that time, I was working like crazy. If I wasn't fighting, I was studying. I knew my brother's survival and mine relied a lot on how useful we were to our father. I only had in mind to grow strong enough to protect my brother and try not to upset my father too much. You remember my father was looking for heirs at some point? Yes? But it was just your brother and you, wasn't it? Not exactly. In terms of blood-related sons, yes. However, my father had other sons. Orphans that he had chosen himself, and who were trained every day to become stronger. I think he always had a hunch that my brother and I might not be enough, or devoted enough to him. I barely met them, but unlike me, those men were desperate to please my father and to become his real heir. Me coming into the picture didn't really please them, and they were constantly looking to annoy me or my younger brother. Yesem taught 3 other boys, as well as me. What happened to them? Yesem said he helped you escape the capital, but... Ashen scoffed. That's what he claims. I don't know what the truth is, but I do think a cunning old man like him could easily try and lie his way out of it. As I said, I lost consciousness when my body hit the sea, but my father sent men to find me, and kill me. His other sons, to be exact. Yesem said he saw me fall from another window of the castle. He went to find my father, but found him in a rage, yelling orders to either confirm my death, or finish the job. When he understood that his students were sent out to kill me, he rushed out of the castle to try and save me. According to him, they could see my body drifting. He claims he tried to stop them, and stood between me and their weapons. As their former teacher, it did make sense they were reluctant to shoot him. He stood there until my body disappeared across the waves, but more of my father's men arrived before he could search for me, and he was taken and jailed. I see. So you really don't know if he did try to save you? Ashen shrugged. They were now slowly heading southeast, following some of the larger streets, but Cecilia thought she recognized the way to the fish market or at least its general direction. The smell of the sea was getting stronger around them too, and she could hear the waves, their sound growing from afar. No. Everyone else who was involved was either killed or fled God knows where away from here. He could very well be saying this to keep his head. I was reluctant to kill my former teacher, but he keeps doing things that go against my will, and putting the little trust I have in him in jeopardy. Like when you sent him to find you a princess. Cecilia's eyes were full of kindness, which made Ashen hesitate. He could see she already believed in the old counselor's upright character, but he didn't think the same. In fact, when Yesem had come back with her, Ashen was even more furious. Although it was easy to make the link between his fake death and disappearance of 2 years in the Dragon Empire, how could Yesem have known about his tie with the imperial family? He hated that the counselor had brought Cecilia, of all people. Not because he didn't want to see her again, but because it made him worry about the old man's intentions toward her. Despite his gentle smile and clear eyes, Yesem was harder to decipher than anybody else. He had begged Ashen to spare 2 of his former adopted brothers upon his return and even hid them, the same ones that had tried to kill him. And when he had tried to banish the old counselor once and for all, he came back with the most unforeseen candidate of all. Thinking back now, it felt more and more like the counselor had his own plans, and intended to use Cecilia against him. Just, don't trust him, he finally said. Most of the time, I feel like that old man is just ready to do anything to save his neck. He is the only counselor that used to serve my father that I kept alive. Even the clan leaders are wary of him. Most of them don't understand why I kept that cunning old man alive when I cleared out most of my father's followers. Sometimes, I wonder the same. But He did protect me from my father's wrath a few times. He was also my brother's teacher, and I know I owe him for being half of the king I am today. Cecilia smiled, and gently caressed the back of his hand with her thumb. It's good that you are giving him the benefit of the doubt, she said. Maybe the counselor just wants to stay alive, but, if he was really a bad person, I don't think he would have traveled all the way to the Empire to ask me to come. Don't you think he did it to use you against me? Cecilia sighed. After years of being involved in political conflicts and war, it couldn't be helped that the king was so doubtful of everyone's intentions. Even more so for a man who had once been his father's advisor too. However, Cecilia thought of herself as a pretty good judge of character, and she never felt any ill intent from the old counselor. In fact, Yusum seemed to genuinely care for the king, enough to risk his own life to bring him a new potential wife. He could have been killed so many times on his way to and from the Empire. He didn't know about our relationship, Ashen, she muttered, gently grabbing his arm with her other hand to get closer. I think Yusum is just hoping to show you there are other paths than the one you've taken. The king remained silent for a while. For some reason, he didn't like Cecilia defending another man. After a while, he shook his head. Let's stop talking about the old man. We're almost where I wanted to take you. To take me, she repeated, a bit surprised. She hadn't realized he had been purposely guiding their steps until now. Earlier, she had realized they were clearly headed toward the sea, but to her surprise, Ashen took her away from the port and the fish market, even farther east, to the end of the island that constituted the inner capital. For a while, it seemed like they were going to reach the coast, but, as they reached the last lines of houses, Ashen took her through smaller, narrower streets. She had never been to this neighborhood before, and the fact that they were headed to a destination he had picked made her heart flutter. The paths between the houses became so narrow that she had to let go of his arm, and while still holding hands, they went one behind the other through the little paths. Where are we going? She whispered, a bit excited. You'll see. The smile on his face when he glanced over his shoulder made her heart skip a beat. Ashen didn't smile often, but he was irresistible when he did. He was usually so serious, closed, and stern, his smile was even hard to imagine. Yet when he did, he suddenly seemed a lot younger, and so handsome that he made Cecilia blush instantly. He was like a young god in all his glory. She held his hand a bit tighter, and followed him with the excitement building up in her stomach. Finally, they reached the very end of the coast, past the last deserted streets, gardens, and trees, where there was nothing else other than the sea, for as far as their eyes could see. Because the waves were so quiet tonight, it felt beautiful, almost eerie, with the moon lighting up the shimmering surface of the water. Cecilia thought they'd admire the view, but to her surprise, Ashen kept pulling her along. Here, he said. To her surprise, she saw him go down some invisible trail past the coast, and realized there were stairs built into the rocks. They would have been impossible to see, if someone didn't purposely stand almost at the edge and look down to their right. The stairs had been very roughly cut too, so there weren't two the same, and they had to go down slowly to avoid slipping. It would have been impossible to use it if the weather hadn't been perfectly calm. Only on a night like this, with no wind and no rain, was it safe to go down. Cecilia had to hold up the hem of her dress, and Ashen went down very slowly too, holding her hand securely at each step she took. They passed in front of little holes in the rock, some bigger than others, and before they got there, Cecilia had already guessed what kind of place they were headed to. The cave wasn't very large, but it was certainly beautiful. The stairs were taking an abrupt turn to the right, and there was a very small pathway inside, where they had to stay close to the wall on their right, while on their left, the sea waves gently came and went, filling a little river that went deeper inside. Despite the small entryway, there were other holes higher in the cave that the moonlight was shining through, illuminating the cave and its river in a gorgeous, blue-white light. For a while, she thought the river water was shimmery white, with dozens of little colored pieces at its bottom, until she looked closer. A bed of white seashells. The beautiful seashells were paving the entire river bed, along with pieces of blue or green frosted, smooth sea glass. Because the water depth was so shallow and the waves gentle, it looked like a shimmering mirror reflecting the moonlight in even more beautiful colors. Cecilia's breath was taken away. "It's beautiful," she muttered. Surprised, Ashen suddenly stopped walking and turned to her. He was staring so intensely, Cecilia blushed helplessly. "What? Just now, you didn't stutter." She blushed even more, and lowered her head, nodding weakly. "It happens, sometimes." Ashen smiled and closed the distance between them in a couple of steps. "So you like it? It's a beautiful place." Cecilia nodded. "How did you find it?" "My mother showed it to me and my brothers years ago." According to her, only a few young people knew of its existence when she was young. I guess most people living in the capital now have no idea. It's impossible to get here most of the time. It takes the perfect weather conditions that we rarely have here, and a low tide. We can only stay here for, perhaps 2 or 3 hours before this whole place gets filled by the sea again." Cecilia was amazed. This was such an ephemeral and beautiful place. To think this place possibly wouldn't be available to anyone for a few days, before becoming such an enchanting place again. Ash smiled and turned around again, pulling her deeper into the cave. There were little holes going deeper, but they couldn't be accessed by a human. The floor was humid, with a thin layer of half-dry sand, and some seashells forgotten by the tide scattered around them. Cecilia couldn't help but try to avoid stepping on them on the rocky floor. Ashen took her to a little area that was about 1 step above the little river, drier and large enough, around the size of a small room. He took off his large, thick fur coat, and put it down on the floor for them to sit on it. He sat first, inviting Cecilia to join him. She sat shyly next to him, admiring the view they had on the little river and farther away past the cave entrance, on the large eastern sea. He gently pressed his lips against her shoulder, before taking the back of her hands to his lips as well. "I know it's not as great as the wonders of the Dragon Empire, but I wanted to show you the best of my world. It's truly amazing, Ashen. I love this place." To his surprise, Cecilia leaned in and initiated a kiss between them. The king answered her kiss, his breathing a bit unsteady. His lips against hers were trying to keep up, yet holding back a bit, as if he was afraid to lose control. He was frowning faintly, looking almost in pain. Cecilia liked this restraint about him, though. She smiled, and while their lips parted, she caressed his cheek gently. "Aren't you cold?" he muttered. "You're the one with a stutter now," she chuckled. The king blushed a little. He couldn't hide his troubles, but the princess found him even more charming when he was embarrassed and visibly torn inside. She smiled and put another quick peck on his lips. Then, she stared right into his eyes and putting her hands around his neck, she moved to sit across his lap, straddling him. Her heart was beating wildly in her chest, but she had never felt so confident and bold. She smiled at him. "I'm never cold," she said, a dash of pink on her cheeks. His breath taken away, Ashen grabbed the princess' nape, and pulled her in for a wilder kiss. The heat rapidly increased around them. Their damp and hot breathing and their wild kiss made any thought about the cold irrelevant. It was just the two of them, in their little world, kissing and caressing each other. The memory from that morning was rekindled in a matter of seconds, making them both lose their hesitation to indulge in some tender exchanges. Cecilia loved that he never wore a shirt, and left his torso bare for her to caress and touch. It was like a vast, warm, and soft land under her fingers. He kept caressing her, but as he was hesitant to undress her, Cecilia took the first step, slowly undoing her leather belt and tossing it aside, taking her arms out of her sleeves, the dress naturally falling down to reveal her skin. Ashen's breathing stopped for a second, and she saw him gasp very faintly, as if breath taken. "You're beautiful," he muttered. He wished he had words closer to the truth of what he was experiencing right then, but none seemed enough to describe the vision of the young goddess facing him. It was enough to make his heart wrench in pain. She was down on her knees, a bit higher than him, and he was admiring her from below, completely blown away by her mythical beauty. Her skin was glowing like cold gold under the moonlight, circled down by a myriad of her dark, walnut-brown curls. Cecilia's striking green eyes had a more teal shade from the water reflected in them, and her lips were a bit purplish from the makeup that had been wiped off earlier. With only the nacre and seashell jewelry left, and the blue fabric streaming down her body, she was like a sea goddess, or a mermaid, who emerged from the sea to ravish his heart. Like a mere mortal man, he had no power to resist her call, his own barely restrained desire building up within. His hesitation blown away, his hand came to her body again, running over her skin, caressing each curve. For a while, he couldn't even think of kissing her. He was too busy looking at the gorgeous woman she had become. It was like a fantasy in front of him, a dream so real he could barely believe it. It felt almost forbidden. A sin a man couldn't resist. The appeal was strong, and his resolve weak. They both wanted it, and her eyes said so too. "You're being shy again," she muttered, as if amused, putting a soft kiss on his lips, like a cold caress. It was just enough to entice the two lovers some more. He claimed the next kiss, and soon enough, they were exchanging kisses slowly but passionately, as if tasting each other. They could feel each other smiling in between, happiness overflowing. Their hands were picking up the rhythm too. Cecilia's hands were following the strong lines of his muscles, and crossing paths on his back. Ashen's fingers were more sensual. He was already caressing her hips, leaving his fingertips on her inner thighs, making her shiver from a mix of excitement and nervousness. She was a bit embarrassed to be left in her underwear already, but there was no denying the heat beneath the fabric. He began caressing her over the fabric, making the princess blush helplessly again. She had been so bold seconds ago, but now, her inexperience was starting to catch her up. Meanwhile, Ashen slowly moved his kisses from her lips, to her cheek, her jawline, and then her neck. Much to her surprise, he paid special attention to that part of her body which usually made her shy. Cecilia felt his butterfly kisses, all over her scars, so faint and soft she almost felt like crying. He was melting all of her insecurities away with his gentleness. Silently telling her it was all right, that he loved that part of her too. It felt like he kissed every single inch of her throat, and for once, she felt as if there was nothing there. No scar to constantly pull on her skin, get itchy or dry. The place she had lost all sensations and seemed to be revived under the king's tender kisses. She almost felt like crying in relief, as if that part of her had been healed somehow. Then, just as she was getting a bit soothed, Ashen's lips progressed further down, excising her again. Cecilia had never really considered her feminine allure, but now, she was receiving unexpected sensations from her chest. It was like her extremities were connected right down to her lower abdomen, and sending delicious signals of pleasure from the king fondling them. Ashen licked the other, suddenly focusing on them, making Cecilia gasp in unexpected pleasure. Her two ends were so sensitive, each lick and caress was sweet, electrifying her whole body without warning. She had no idea a woman could experience such things from her small bosom. "Ashen," she cried faintly. "I like when you call my name." He smiled, and moved to kiss her lips again, letting her breathe a little. Cecilia moved her hands, one still combing his hair as they kissed, the other exploring the lines of his abs and lower abdomen. She didn't want to stay too passive. After all, she had been the one to initiate this. She shyly moved her hand toward his pants, a bit unsure what to do next. She found an opening, and gently began touching him too. She didn't have the courage to be too bold, but caressing the hot flesh was already bold enough, in her mind. Indeed, the king's dark eyes suddenly lit up with a new fire, making her hot too. She watched with a bit of excitement as his breathing became louder, and he moved his hips a bit, allowing her better access to his lower body. It was still a bit scary to imagine what was going to come next. After a short while, Ashen grunted and, as if to even her movements, placed his hand between her legs again. He was much more direct this time, and Cecilia moaned as his fingers drifted under the thin piece of underwear. The sounds her wet flesh immediately made from the rubbing were so embarrassing, she closed her eyes, unable to look at him, and tried to focus on her hand's movement. She listened to Ashen's breathing, so close and so hot. The sounds echoing in the cave were completely erotic right now, the faraway sound of waves wasn't enough to hide it anymore. Her own voice took her by surprise when she realized those coquettish cries of pleasure came from her. She realized her hand was slowing down on Ashen's hard rod, but it couldn't be helped, the heat between her legs was overwhelming. Come here. Ashen's unexpected mature and dominating voice sent a new shrill to her lower regions, and Cecilia felt herself tip backward before she could realize it. To her surprise, she found her back against the fur, her legs spread, and Ashen's smiling face over her. "What are you doing?" she muttered, embarrassed by her new position. "Trying to please my queen," he smiled, before going down. His mouth against her opening made her yelp without thinking. Her panties came off, and the cold wind she felt was quickly taken over by his hot and moist breath. She gasped, her lower abdomen torn with excitement. She slightly arched her body without thinking, but the movements of Ashen's tongue made her legs weak. It was hot, humid, and totally obscene, but her cries of pleasure came before she could stop them. The thoughts of his experience with this were quickly blown away by how good it felt. A bit strange, but there was no mistaking it, her shameless lower half enjoyed this. Cecilia had never imagined was this crude and unfiltered, despite her mind in a hot daze. She hadn't thought much about it, but this didn't feel like something that could be dreamt, more like a sheer, raw piece of reality. She closed her eyes again, focusing on her sensations, and Ashen's shoulder and hands under her fingers. She wanted to enjoy this, and feel herself as a woman under his caresses. It was all about letting her inhibitions go, and trusting the other. Soon enough, she felt her insides become embarrassingly wet, and her lower abdomen begging for more. "Ashen," she called to him. "Ashen, please." He stopped and gently placed a trail of kisses from her abdomen to her chest and neck, all the way back up to her lips. Her lover had a strange taste now, but she didn't hate it. He kept kissing her lovingly, while his lower body moved between her legs, a bit impatient despite his clothes. Cecilia smiled and playfully grabbed his butt. "You temptress," he groaned against her chin. "Take it off," she ordered with a smile. He grunted, struggling to take his pants off without moving from his position too much. Ceci's arms around him wouldn't let go. Finally, he was above her, and with a smile, the princess grabbed his shoulders, making him roll to the side so she'd be the one on top. "Let me do it," she said from above him. He nodded, his hands grabbing her hips, and pulled his head up for another kiss. "Go slow," he muttered. Cecilia nodded, but slow or not, she felt ready. Never had she felt more like a woman than right now. She took a deep breath, trying to remember the few pieces of advice she'd heard before, and slowly rubbed their intimate parts together. The slow teasing made him groan and breathe louder, but she enjoyed feeling her body more and more ready. Finally, she gradually went down. Despite her breathing, she could feel his thickness push against her walls, a bit painful. Ashen's hand on her waist was guiding her, though she could tell he was holding himself back from just pushing in. A sharp pain made her grimace, but she didn't shy away from it, only going down further, focusing on the good sensations to occult the rest. Despite the pain, she could tell there was also something fulfilling. His heat inside her felt good. She breathed loudly and slowly moved, holding on to his torso while going back up and down. "Are you all right?" he asked in a whisper. His husky voice excited her a little. She could tell he was enjoying her insides pressing around him, and it made Cecilia smile and forget the pain a bit more. She bravely moved again, stubbornly looking for genuine pleasure. The pain wasn't as bad as she had imagined, but it wasn't going away. Cecilia ignored it, and kept going, her graceful body gliding up and down. It was like a dance on his body, a search for that perfect harmony. The sound of their flesh slapping began to resonate in the cave, along with their heated breathing. Ashen grabbed the curls around her neck and pulled her in for a kiss, trying to tame his instincts. Her narrow walls were driving him insane. He wanted to ram in savagely, yet the still rational part of him was terrified at the idea of hurting her. His manhood was sucked in and out, making him grunt in helpless pleasure already. The slow back and forth was akin to torture, pulling his sanity and desire further and further from one another. Without thinking he began moving under her, his hands grabbing her hips and taking her with him. Cecilia cried out, in pleasure this time, and barely held herself from falling, holding on to his shoulders, her mouth constantly open to let out successive moans. They had found a rhythm, a little rough but not savage. She could feel his pounding resonating throughout her entire body, the waves of pleasure slowly obliterating the pain. Her chest is bouncing above his face, her hair covering them like a curtain. Sometimes, they'd find a way to kiss, but there was no slowing down, only the awkward, jerky, irregular breathing and their lips trying not to miss each other. "Are you all right?" he asked. Cecilia nodded helplessly at first, trying to catch her breath. "I like it," she muttered. "I like it. Ah. Ah. I like it." He smiled, and kept going, perhaps a bit more restless. His manhood wanted more, and he could feel she had grown more used to him. Their exchange was wetter, hotter. He moved to sit up, letting her wrap her arms around his shoulders, and moved his hips a bit faster. His excitement was taking over, but he could tell he was close to release, and her cries had turned into excited screams. Trying to keep his last restraint, he thrust again and again, listening to Ceci's voice and focusing on her to finish. He looked for her eyes, staring at her dazzling beauty, the thin tears shining in her eyes, and her cute, flustered expressions. His eyes narrowed briefly, and he found his release, pulling out almost 1 second too late. He grunted, gushing against her hip, and let out a long sigh of relief. Cecilia's breathing was still hot and loud against his ear, and he moved his hand again, caressing her while his arm was holding her close. She cried again, her nails scratching his back when he teased her little button, but he now knew the sound of pleasure in her voice. He kept going, making circles on her entrance with her own fluids, making her hot and breathing hard again. "Ashen," she cried. "I love your voice, Ceci," he gently whispered to her, caressing her hair. His hot, deep voice was the trigger she needed. Something brutally sparked in her lower abdomen, cutting her breath and making her gasp. It wasn't what she expected, but it was a new sensation, and definitely pleasurable. She took several long seconds to take it in, feeling her breathing slowly calm down. Ashen's hands were gently caressing her legs, letting her come back to her senses by herself. When Ceci opened her eyes again, she met with Ashen's, and they smiled at each other, in a strange daze. Without a word, they slowly pulled closer for another tender kiss. Their bodies against each other, caressing each other's hair, they kissed slowly, only focused on the other, forgetting everything else. There was nothing special about this kiss. It was a kiss like many others between two lovers, but it had an unbearable, almost painful taste of happiness caught in a fleeting, fragile moment. When they quietly parted again, Ashen left a gentle kiss on her shoulder. "How do you feel?" "I'm fine," Cecilia muttered, a bit embarrassed. "You don't have to ask so much." "Sorry, I'll stop now." "Then shall we bathe a bit?" "Can we?" "This water should be fine, it's not deep at all and surprisingly clean. As long as we don't fall asleep." Cecilia glanced back and, indeed, the water was rather clear, for sea water. Plus, she had been intrigued by it for a while now. With Ashen's help, she got up, surprised by the lingering sensations in her body. She didn't think her insides would feel so strange after X, but she didn't mind it much. It was like proof she wasn't a virgin anymore. Ashen went in the water first, carefully stepping on the bed of seashells and shivered. Then, he forced himself to dip his whole body in, although it wasn't that deep. He looked surprisingly good with his white hair wet. Cecilia joined him quickly, trying to ignore how she was in front of him. After all, it was too late to hide, and she didn't want to act shy. She bravely stepped in after him, finding the water at a good temperature thanks to her natural body heat. "I love this place," she said with a smile. "I knew you would. I'm happy I brought you here." For a while, they swam around and teased each other, playing with the water. However, just as Ashen had said, it was rising rather quickly. Cecilia noticed the water that was previously at their waist was soon almost to their shoulders, and the path was already under a couple inches of water when they went to retrieve their clothes. "Let's go," said Ashen, taking her hand after they both got dressed. "I don't want to have to call your ride to get back." Cecilia chuckled, amused. She could only imagine what Ashen would risk if Cray found them there. She glanced one last time around the cave and carefully put one of the seashells she had collected in her pocket. It wasn't the largest or probably even the prettiest she could have found, but it was intact, in good condition, and she liked the size of it. She had taken just one, for memory. If this cave was their secret she could only visit once in a while with him, at least she'd have a memento until the next time. "Ceci, if you keep making that face, I'm really going to have Cray stick to you like the stench behind an old dragon's butt." She bit her lips, glancing at her reflection in the mirror and noticed she had begun smiling again without even thinking about it. In the mirror, Nana, who was helping her brush her hair, exchanged a smile with her. "Well, Lady Tessa, I think you're just a bit upset over last night." "How could I be?" protested Tessa, blushing. I barely remember anything." No one in the room believed that. She had been grumbling and beating a poor pillow for a while now, retreating to the end of Cecilia's large bed and blushing constantly. When Cecilia had come back late the previous night, her cousin was nowhere in sight, and this morning, she had barged into the room after Naptuni, complaining about her headache and what a drunk she had been. "At least Lady Ceci looks happy about her evening." Cecilia nodded a bit shyly, but still smiling, and grabbed another little piece of fruit, their breakfast laid on the pretty vanity table. Then, remembering something, she took out the pretty shell, which she had placed in a box the previous night. "Nana, can I ask you something? Do you think this could be made into a necklace, or a bracelet?" She showed her the seashell, and Nana immediately nodded. "Of course. But you should ask Lady Bastet, I'm sure her people will make something gorgeous out of this. They can varnish it and polish it, and make it into any jewelry you want." "Is it a special seashell?" Nana looked a bit curious, her eyes going to the seashell that had nothing special about it, and Cecilia's fond gaze on it. She could definitely tell this seashell had a significant story behind it, and was curious to hear it, but the princess simply nodded once again. The meaning behind this seashell was something she wanted to keep to herself. Despite not getting back too late, she had a hard time sleeping the previous night, her heart beating fast the entire time and her head full of steamy memories from the cave with Ashen. She regretted they hadn't been able to at least sleep together, but they were both very aware of all the eyes on them. They had even gone back separately to the castle, and went directly to their bedrooms, as if nothing had happened, their thoughts full of each other. "If only this rain would stop soon," sighed Nana. The downpour outside was even more impressive than the other night's storm. It had been raining an alarming volume of water, constantly for the past few hours. It was already like this when Cecilia had woken up, and the usually beautiful views from the suite's balcony were completely blocked by the heavy curtains of rain. She noticed how Nana looked a bit worried. "Do downpours like this not occur often?" "Not this much," she shook her head. "We're used to the wind and rain, even the storms, but I haven't seen such a bad downpour in a while." Indeed, it was the heaviest rain Cecilia and Tessandra had ever witnessed. They weren't used to much rain at all in the Dragon Empire. The capital and most of the empire were too far south to get more than what they usually did in the rainy season. Cecilia's family's castle in the north had mostly snow, except for the warmest months. Only their grandmother's castle, located halfway between both, had some rain, but it was hot and humid, and certainly never this cold nor heavy. "Is it really bad?" "It should be fine," muttered Neptune. "The capital is on a mountain anyway, so even if the streets are flooded a bit, the water will only fall far below, by the river. I'm more worried about people at the entrances of the bridges, on the shores of the Saura, but there are evacuation systems, so it should be all right. I think." For a second, Cecilia was confused about why people on the other sides of the bridges would have an issue, since they were on the same level as Estera, and the Saura far below, until she remembered the wall. If the walls meant to protect the city were keeping the water from draining properly, then the areas near the capital could get flooded. "How long do you think it could hold?" Nana's hands stopped moving, and she frowned, obviously doing the calculations in her head. "If it keeps going like this, then, it could start accumulating in a few hours. By midday, if it hasn't stopped or slowed down, the water will start being retained." Cecilia frowned. A few hours was a really short time, and acting too late could become really problematic. Although her experience there the previous time hadn't been the best, she could still remember the many people outside of those walls, waiting for a chance to get in. She couldn't even imagine anyone outside in this weather. It was cold, humid, and only a proper roof could shelter them, but many were homeless, even within the capital. And they hadn't seen many examples of people helping each other out. She suddenly stood up, and walked to the wardrobe, opening it wide. "Ceci, do I have something that could protect me from the rain?" she asked Nupia, who had been standing by the door this whole time. "Yes, 2 of your coats are made of waterproof material, but... Princess, I'm not sure you should go out in this weather." "Call your siblings, we're going out," Cecilia retorted. "It's time you 3 prove your worth. Nana, can you ask your family to help us out?" "We're going to the bridges," exclaimed Nana, running up to her. "To help out?" "Yes. I can't stand here knowing those people are in danger. But, maybe the rain will stop soon." "No, Ceci is right," said Tessa, staring outside. "This is going to last for a while." Neptune glanced out the window, baffled, but she was incapable of seeing whatever Tessandra was staring at. She hesitated for a few seconds, fidgeting, but as Tessandra sighed and got up, she stood up too. "How do you know?" she finally asked, while Tessandra put on the other coat. "Our eyes," said Tessa, pointing at her dark irises. "We can see much better and farther than normal people, to be able to ride our dragons. And with how far I can see this rain, I can tell you, it's not going to stop before tonight at the very best." Neptune went a bit white. She didn't doubt the 2 young women a single second, and if Tessandra said it was going to rain until the evening, she fully believed it. "Oh no," she muttered. "What are we going to do? All those poor people." "Nana, do you have a raincoat?" asked Cecilia, putting on another pair of shoes while preparing to leave. "Yes, it's upstairs in Uncle's apartment." "Go get it. Then, I will need to buy some buns from your family. Do you think they can prepare large quantities of buns like the ones you sold us?" Nana's chest inflated, as if her family's pride was on the line. "Of course. We can have them made at the storehouse near the bridges, in the west part of the capital. We may not have much fresh fish left, but we have a lot of stored food, and vegetables too. We can even fill them with sweet potatoes." "Great!" Cecilia smiled. "Can you ask your family to prepare them to distribute? If you can do as much as possible, I promise I will cover the costs." "I'm sure my family will refuse to let you pay, Lady Cecilia, it's our people after all. But I will be going now." "Thank you, Nana. We will catch up with you later." While Nana ran out ahead, very determined and happy to help, Cecilia and Tessandra left right after her. "What about us?" asked Tessandra. "Let's buy tea from the Hachette family," explained Cecilia. "We can ask for their help, and Lady Bastet too. We will need a place like a shelter, and a lot of people to distribute warm tea and food." "All right. We could use some soldiers' help, Tessa." Her cousin stopped right in the middle of the corridor and frowned, turning to her. She progressively went redder. "Ceci, you're not." "Nana is already gone," said Ceci with a faint smile, "and I'm sure her brother will be working today too." "But if you go and ask, you did this on purpose, didn't you?" exclaimed Tessa, literally stomping her foot down. "Ceci, you knew you wanted to ask Sab, and you sent Nana ahead on purpose to set me up." Cecilia bit her lower lip, slightly amused. She hadn't really thought that far ahead, but judging from her cousin's flustered reaction, Tessa wouldn't have believed her anyway. Plus, she knew the proud Tessandra all too well. Without a very good reason, she probably would have denied everything and avoided poor Sabale for a while. I can't. Tessa, please. We don't have much time. She saw Tessandra clench her fists, her face red as if she was about to explode or breathe fire at any moment now. Luckily, before she could protest more, the two other triplets arrived next to them, Nupia explaining the situation briefly to them. One of you goes to help Nana, ordered Cecilia immediately. One goes with Tessa, and the last with me, so if we need to communicate, we can send one of you. This time, they didn't discuss at all, and the boy departed immediately to catch up to Naptuni, while Nupia stepped to Cecilia's side, her younger sister behind Tessa. Before anyone could add anything, though, two royal guards suddenly appeared at the end of the corridor. Tessandra went white for a second, before realizing neither of them were Sabale. The two men walked up to Cecilia, and to their surprise, respectfully bowed. Princess Cecilia of the Dragon Empire. Your presence is requested by His Majesty and the Royal Council. Now. She frowned. Yes, Your Highness. Cecilia sighed. If Ashen had sent those men, she couldn't refuse, but she was still thinking what was going on outside was much more important. Still, she took a breath in and turned to her cousin, determined. Tessa, go ahead, please. I'll try to talk to Ishira or Hephael if I can see them there. I'll catch up to you guys, but Nana is going to need you. Tessandra sighed, unhappy about the situation, but she glared at the guards, and then toward Nupia, raising her index finger at the female servant. If anything happens to my cousin, this time I swear you'll pay for it. I understand, Lady Tessa, said Nupia, not flinching at all. Her cousin grunted in frustration, but quickly turned around and left, probably to catch up to Naptuni before she left the castle. Left alone with Nupia and the guards, Cecilia turned to them, a bit annoyed, but still composed. Let's go. Before the guards had even turned around, Cecilia knew they would be escorting her to the council room. The matter couldn't have been too serious, though, judging by the way the guards walked ahead without even checking to see if she was still following. Still, she wondered why they would suddenly call her to the meeting. When she arrived in the room, the tension was palpable. Once again, 7 out of the 9 chairs were filled, with all their eyes going to her as soon as she stepped in. Cecilia's green eyes immediately looked for Ashen's. The king was seated on his throne, sullen. He went from a slouching position to sitting up as soon as she arrived, his upper body leaning forward in her direction, but the frown between his eyebrows didn't disappear. Since he wasn't glaring at her, Cecilia imagined his anger was fueled by someone and something else. She looked around at all the eyes on her. To her surprise and relief, Hephael was now seated there instead of his father, with his cousin Ishira right next to him, her hands joined in front of her, and she smiled at Cecilia when their eyes met. The other eyes around the room weren't as welcoming, though. The 2 candidates of the Yekara clan were also there and smiling, although their smiles had something sinister about them. Seated between them was their clan leader, a man as tall as he was thin, with long hair going down his shoulders, a square chin, and piercing eyes. He was the one glaring at her the most, but Cecilia ignored him, not intimidated in the slightest. Except for the remaining Pangaha candidate, Istis, all the other faces were unfamiliar, or people Cecilia hadn't been able to chat with before. It was clear which people were favorable to her, those who were neutral, and those who hated her. The latter were the most numerous, and did not bother to hide their feelings, either. Things were considerably tenser than when she had come here the first time. Cecilia quickly bowed in Ashen's direction. "Good morning, Your Highness, Honorable Lords. May I ask what is the reason for my presence here?" "Princess Cecilia," sighed a man who ought to be the representative of the Darossafe tribe. "Some people here are expressing concerns over your status as a candidate." Cecilia frowned, and crossed her arms. "I'm curious to hear your concerns," she said calmly. "A hoe can't marry a king, that's what," scoffed Safia. She had said it just loud enough for all to hear, despite the downpour outside. Ashen stood up furiously, glaring at her. "Yekara," he hissed, "I suggest you watch your words carefully." "Why?" retorted the Yekara leader, not afraid. "Your Majesty, my niece raises a true concern for your sake. It is part of the rules of the competition that all candidates should be virgins." Cecilia's blood left her face. She wasn't embarrassed about losing her virginity. She was shocked they already knew. It hadn't been a day since she had been with Ashen. She glanced around, many people looking embarrassed to hear this, doubtful or sorry for her. More were delighted by the accusation, though. "Is that why you had me come here?" Cecilia said, not hiding the anger in her voice. "Princess or not, you have to follow the rules of the competition," said the Yekara leader. "We have several witnesses claiming they saw the princess going out alone last night, and you came back to the castle late in the night." "Princess Cecilia and her cousin were invited to the Hachette family house," retorted Hephael. "I already told the council that, and many witnesses will confirm this as well." "Oh, we know. But the princess was seen parting ways with her cousin, and a man came to her after that. She definitely spent a part of the night with him." Cecilia was frustrated and mad. She exchanged a glance with Ashen, but it was now clear why he had requested her presence. He wanted her to decide whether to reveal their relationship or not. At the very least, Giselle wasn't here this time. It should have made her glad, but somehow, she had an ominous feeling about her absence. "Well," said the Yekara lord. "We knew you aren't quite eloquent, princess, but we still ought to hear at least an explanation. Or proof we're wrong. After all, we do have means to check your words." An old woman stepped forward, probably a nurse or something of the sort, but she ignored her. Instead, Cecilia glared at the man who was now trying to annoy her. He had the look of a predator toying with his prey. He knew he was right, and perhaps, he even knew who she had actually spent the night with. What he wanted was to humiliate her, expose her in front of the council. He may have thought a young woman who had just lost her virginity would have been terribly embarrassed of the situation and ashamed. However, Cecilia crossed her arms, not shy in the slightest. "It's true," she said. "However, it doesn't disqualify me as a candidate if the man I spent the night with was His Majesty." Many eyes shifted from her to the king. The White King was smiling. For many, that unique sight was absolutely terrifying. Rather than a happy man, it looked like a predator showing its fangs, and when he relaxed his shoulders and sat back down, many got chills. He remained silent, though, so the Yekero leader was confused for a second, his eyes going from the king to the princess. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" said Cecilia with a smile. You broke the rules. We will not accept a sullied candidate as our queen." "You're not making any sense, Lord Yekero. Surely you were not expecting the future queen to remain immaculate," retorted Ishara, raising an eyebrow. "How is His Majesty supposed to have his heirs then?" "We shall not accept it," the man insisted. "The purity of the candidates is one of the rules." For the princess suddenly stepped in his direction, suddenly seeming taller, making the older man sit back in his chair and almost swallow his tongue. "His Majesty can confirm I had been with no other man before him," retorted Cecilia, her angry voice suddenly echoing in the room, "and I will not be humiliated by the mere loss of my virginity by any man. If you want to reduce your candidates to mere child-making tools, then all I did was get a head start on them." She looked around, glaring back at those who had been prepared for her humiliation. "You can't even honor the rule of not killing or harming other candidates," hissed Cecilia, "and you're trying to corner me with your rules that don't make sense? A kingdom where a man can take mistresses, but his wife has to be a virgin? How can you ask that of your daughters and nieces?" No one in the room dared to utter a word anymore. In fact, most of the lords were stunned and stuck to their chairs, some of them sending guilty glances toward their candidates. But Cecilia's angry eyes suddenly went to ashen. The king had completely stopped smiling. "Next time, at least ask your king to stay pure too." A heavy silence befell the room after her words. She hadn't meant to target Ashen with this, but she couldn't spare him, and the guilt was legitimate too. After all, he had agreed to those rules as well as the others, and even if she knew it was her own pride talking, Cecilia was still bitter about Giselle. Even worse, she couldn't swallow the hypocrisy of these men toward their own female relatives, and she refused to let him be used against her. If anything, Cecilia had grown up in a house where women were not looked down upon, and she wouldn't let herself be here. After a short while, someone in the room chuckled, awkwardly breaking the silence. "This is why I admire the Empress so much." The woman who had spoken was the only one seated as one of the family lords. In fact, she could have almost been mistaken for a man, with her short hair, strong jaw, and the fact that she wore the least jewelry out of all 7. She was wearing a modest, dark brown outfit too, with her legs open and large boots, some muddy water staining the beautiful floor under her. She turned to the other lords with a smile. The princess made a reasonable point. "If it was indeed His Majesty with her, I don't believe there's any valid reason for her to be taken out of the competition." "The Hashid family supports this," immediately nodded Hefael. "We're not holding a vote," exclaimed the Yekero leader. "We are," retorted Ashen. Because he had been so silent until then, the king's ice-cold voice took them all by surprise. The Yekero leader glared his way, and for a while, it seemed everyone was suddenly reminded the real monster was still there, just unusually passive. There was a very faint general movement in the room, a lot of people stepping an inch or two farther away from the throne. Some of the lords even nervously shifted their positions on their chairs, sitting straight or leaning away. Even when he was slouching on his throne, Ashen was effortlessly dominating them all. The leader of the Yekara clan did try to hold his stare for a while, but Ashen wasn't even glaring. He was like an ice fortress, a wall of contempt with the eyes of a monster. Soon enough, the man was forced to look down and admit his defeat toward the king. Still, he raised his head high again, gripping his seat and looking sullen. Since he couldn't convince the king, the leader of the Yekara glared at his peers as if to dissuade them. Much to his annoyance, though, the leader of the Seson tribe then raised his hand. The Seson tribe also supports the princess statement. We won't require any more proof, either. The Duro-Safe tribe too, exclaimed the man in the next seat. With already 4 out of the 7 lords having spoken up, the outcome didn't even need to be said. This was Cecilia's win, and her green eyes went to the Yekara leader as if to dare him to speak up and raise this issue again. Are we done? She asked in a loud and clear voice. Despite her stutter, the imperious tone in her voice was leaving no doubt as to her superiority there. Those who had tried to humiliate her had completely lost. This princess who had seemed to almost hide behind her cousin all along was now clearly standing her ground alone, and making a laughing stock out of the clan leader. The competition isn't over, the leader of the Pangaha clan declared suddenly. At least now it is clear a few of us actually have the intent to keep things clean. He was actually glaring at the leader of the Yekara clan, not Cecilia. It surprised her a little, but after all, he had lost one of his candidates, probably one of his younger relatives, to this competition already. From the murderous glare he was sending across the room, he had probably identified the culprit as well. However, his rival smirked. He may have lost to the king and the princess, but the Yekara clan leader wasn't going to be afraid of one of his peers. It's not over indeed, he said. Perhaps we need to reconsider this competition, after all. While the two of them kept exchanging glares, Cecilia sighed and turned to Ishara, mimicking with her lips for the young woman to meet her outside. Ishara nodded, and after whispering in her cousin's ear, quietly stepped out first. Cecilia turned back to Ashen, giving him a little nod. Your Majesty, she said, bowing faintly, Lords, I will see you all at tonight's banquet. She didn't want to greet or thank them all excessively. She had already given them enough of her time, and the people whom she wanted to respect her already did and understood her actions. Cecilia turned around and left with her head held high, a silence behind her. She waited until the doors were closed behind her to let out a long sigh. That cunning, said Ishara, appearing in the corridor. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Princess. It's fine, I expected a few things like this to happen. And please, call me Cecilia. Understood. So? Did you need something from me? Cecilia briefly went on to explain the situation, and what she was requiring of the Hashit family. Ishara listened carefully, a faint smile appearing on her lips. I understand, it's a great idea. I will go right away to prepare everything, and meet you outside. We also have honey, sugar, and many edible plants we don't need and can give to people. But don't you talk about money, we will donate it all for free and I'm sure my cousin will agree to this. But, why didn't you mention this in front of the council? I'm sure you could have gotten them all to help. Cecilia shook her head. I don't believe so. They would have done it by obligation, probably unwilling to really help me out, and I didn't want to cause more conflicts between the clans. It is already hard to have them all in one room. Plus, if they are watching me enough to know about what happened between me and His Majesty last night, they will find out about this soon enough too. It's up to them to come to help or not, but it would be less likely if I had asked them. Ishura was a bit impressed. Cecilia hadn't decided to ask for help, not because she feared the clans or wanted to pick which ones would help her. She had considered the current psychological situation between the lords, and chosen to let them think they would help out of their own volition. She had raised the chances for them to actually help willingly, as opposed to if she had asked, they would have done it unwillingly because they didn't like her, perhaps with fewer means or people, out of spite. Now, the lords were going to see this foreign princess winning over the people and were most likely going to intervene to even the score. Ishura smiled, relieved. I think you're right, she nodded. Good. Then I'll leave a note for my cousin and get going right away. I'm sure he'll relay the word too, in a subtle manner. Thank you. I should be the one to thank you, Ishura shook her head. It is disgraceful that the most powerful people of our kingdom are bickering in a room while some of our people are outside in this horrible weather. Thanks for reminding us of that. All right, I'll get going now. See you there. Cecilia nodded and watched the young woman quickly leave to get a servant to send her note to her cousin. Meanwhile, Cecilia turned around, reuniting with Nupia, who had been quietly waiting for her outside of the council room. My siblings, Lady Tessandra and Lady Naptuni, have left the castle already, Princess, she said as they were rushing down the stairs. I also asked for horses, they should be ready for us right outside. Got it. Let's hurry and... Before she could finish that sentence, Cecilia felt a presence behind them on the stairs, and looked back. It was Ashen, who had rushed out of the throne room to catch up to her. Nupia bowed and respectfully went down to the floor below to leave them some privacy. Meanwhile, Cecilia and Ashen reunited, grabbing each other's hands in this narrow spiral staircase. He was still breathing quickly and loudly, probably having just left the council. His chest going up and down in front of her got Cecilia thinking about the previous night, and she stepped back, trying to control her emotions. She was still a bit high on adrenaline from her angry outburst earlier. Her heart just couldn't settle down. Ashen, if it's about earlier, I'm not going to apologize, she said coldly. I didn't mean to implicate you, but no. I know, he said, lowering his head a bit, although he was still significantly taller. I had it coming for a while, anyway. It was just... Well, I think I would have rather had you punch me. You're lucky I prefer words then, chuckled Cecilia. But... I'll think about it next time. Ashen grimaced. Fine. He released one of her hands gently, caressing her cheek instead. He did have an apologetic look in his eyes, although he also looked a bit hurt and sulky from earlier. Perhaps the lords had irritated him more than her remark had. He had remained mostly silent, but that didn't mean he wasn't mad about the Yekara leader's twisted accusations. Cecilia nodded, hiding a faint smile. She was glad this wasn't going to damage their relationship. At least, he was finally owning up to his wrongs. "I had a talk with her last night," he muttered. "You did?" Cecilia exclaimed, shocked. "Yes. When I got back after seeing you, I ran into her, and I knew I had to do something about my relationship with her. For you. I can't pretend, even if it has only been in name for a while, I didn't want to have her still known as my mistress. So, I told Giselle that she and I needed to put an end to this." "How did she react?" Ashen slowly shook his head. "Not well. Perhaps she saw it coming, but she was not crazy about the idea. We argued for a while. In the end, she just left, saying she wanted time to think about it. I don't think she had realized how much you mean to me. So that explained why she wasn't there this time." Cecilia felt a huge weight lifted off her heart. She hadn't even realized how dark and ugly the veil of jealousy was on her feelings for Ashen, but just then, it felt like something had finally come off. She took a deep breath, a bit heavier than she had thought, and looked at him, as if under a new light. "I understand," she muttered. "Thank you for talking to her." "Don't thank me." He shook his head. "I knew this should have been dealt with a while ago. Perhaps I was also feeling sorry toward Giselle for using her." She could understand Ashen wasn't feeling good about suddenly ditching the woman who had been by his side for a while, but Cecilia couldn't feel sorry for his mistress. She had a hunch that Giselle had used him at least as much as he had used her, and things wouldn't be settled so easily, either. From what she had seen, Giselle was not one to let go easily. Still, Cecilia shook her head. She didn't have time to worry and get mad about her rival once again. She took Ashen's hand off her cheek and stepped down. "Sorry, but I have to go," she said. "I'll see you later tonight." After one last look at him, she quickly turned around, about to go down the stairs again. However, before she could take more than 2 steps down, Ashen's hand grabbed her arm, holding her back with a worried expression. "Wait, where are you going? Why are you headed downstairs?" "Outside. To help the people behind the walls. The rain won't stop until tonight, and Nana said they risk being flooded over there. People might get sick without proper shelter." "No, Cecilia, you." Ashen was about to say something, most likely to stop her from going out in this horrid weather, but just then, his eyes met Ceci's. The determination in her striking green irises made him swallow whatever he was going to say. He frowned slightly, having some inner conflict, and then he sighed, his shoulders going down a bit. "Fine. I'll come with you. But the castle. It's not like it's going to fall just because I'm not sitting on my throne for a few hours. I'm coming with you." Cecilia hesitated, but something warm appeared in her heart, slightly glad and relieved. She nodded, happily. "All right. Let's go." They went down the stairs side by side, and just as Nupia had promised, horses were waiting downstairs. Ashen called his own, a very large, black steed, and they left the castle grounds a couple of minutes later. It didn't take more than a few minutes for them and their mounts to be drenched. The rain was so heavy they could barely see ahead, and they couldn't have the horses go faster than a trot, in case they'd slip or hit someone. There was no one out, though. Everyone was probably cautiously staying indoors. The water was dripping down the dark cobblestone, and just like Nana had described, was going down the streets to fall into the riverbed. There was still a lot, however, and some narrower streets seemed to have turned into little rivers, when it wasn't deep puddles filling an intersection. Finally, they arrived at the wall, and with just one glance at Ashen's white hair, the soldiers stepped aside, opening the door for them. They crossed the empty bridge without an issue, but Cecilia could finally take a good look at the situation. Neptune was right again. The few holes in the wall's lower half were like heavy waterfalls, releasing a continuous large stream of water into the river. The water flow was so dense that the holes were clearly not enough. Cecilia glanced further, and there were smaller waterfalls coming from further along the coast, on both sides of the bridge's end, naturally dug beneath the wall as the soil became saturated with water. Luckily, the rocks in the layers beneath wouldn't collapse, but this meant the ground on the other side already had too much water. They reached the next door, but as they yelled for the soldiers to open, it took longer for anyone to respond. After a while, Ashen got down from his horse, and went to bang at the door. To their surprise, it opened, but a heavy flow of water came out of it, like a valve had just opened. Cecilia anxiously watched it cover up to the horse's ankles and Ashen's. They exchanged a glance, both shocked, but it was even worse on the other side. The soldiers tried to let them through, but the crowd of people trying to get to the bridge was making things difficult. They had to open the doors very briefly, and once they got to the other side, Cecilia really took hold of the utter and complete chaos. The brief opening of the door and the water that had been flushed on the bridge wasn't enough. Hundreds of people were gathered, shouting at the soldiers to let them through, water up to their knees for some. The royal guards, 5 times more than usual, were barely keeping the protesters away from the doors thanks to their weapons and the archers on top of the wall, threatening to shoot any trespassers down. Moreover, the crowd was angry, but most of them were families. There were a lot of children crying, even those carried by their parents, and some that couldn't be had water up to their waist. Cecilia's heart dropped. This was worse than they had thought. Ceci! Tessandra ran to her from across the crowd, effortlessly pushing people out of the way to get to her. Sabale was right behind her, not in his soldier uniform but with his large sword on his back, soaked to the bone despite his raincoat. Cecilia threw her shoes to Nupia, and ran to get to her cousin, grabbing Tessa's cold hand. "It's complete hell," she said in one breath, wiping the water off her face. "The guards didn't want to listen to us, but Neptune is amazing. She negotiated with some inns to let the older people stay inside. Our siblings and cousins are spreading the word to our tribe," nodded Sabale. "We also have 2 of our uncles and 1 aunt here. They are trying to make people stay calm, and talking to more shop owners and residents to get help." His eyes quickly went to the king, surprised to see him there, but a bit relieved as well. Ashen and Cecilia exchanged a look. "Ishira will come soon," said Cecilia. "We need to set a tent outside to distribute warm tea and food, so people will stay calm a bit longer." Tessandra nodded, and turned to Sabale. "Let's find the largest, biggest pot we can," she said. I'll go ask around if anyone has a tent that we could use, or perhaps we can set it up in front of someone's shop. Got it. Tessandra quickly turned to Cecilia again. Nana is in the first inn on the second street, she shouted, covering the downpour and loud crowd. I'll go see her. Tessandra nodded, and she and Sabale turned around, running back to the habitations to find what they needed. Cecilia turned to Ashen. I'll stay here, he said. Things will get much worse if all those people get inside the capital or even take the doors down. People won't dare to break the door as long as I'm here. Just as he said that, a rock suddenly hit his temple. He grimaced, and glared back at the crowd, but whoever had done that was staying quiet and hidden under the king's annoyed glare. However, it was clear he wasn't too popular. Many people were glaring back, if not looking at him with terrified eyes. Let us through, a woman screamed. Our children are terrified and drenched. We're going to be flooded. There won't be a better place to shelter yourself in the capital, shouted Ashen, calmly but loud enough for the crowd to hear despite the downpour. There are too many of you, and we don't have time to allocate everyone somewhere. You liar! You're keeping us out while you nobles stay comfortably inside in your palaces. Many more people shouted at him, similar things and furious accusations, but Ashen didn't flinch. Cecilia's heart hurt for him, but the king was incredibly calm and composed. After a while, the crowd calmed down by itself. People weren't less angry, but they were slowly realizing who was standing in front of them, just as drenched and cold as they were, and not turning away from their insults. The king was still there, looking more human than ever, his wet, white hair stuck to his face and his hot breath releasing little clouds of mist. I'm sorry, he suddenly said. His words were followed by a shocked silence. Some people exchanged glances, as if to check they weren't the only ones to have heard this. The king was apologizing to them? It was baffling enough to make everyone calm down, although many whispers went rampant through the crowd. Ashen sighed and pushed his wet hair out of his face. I'll do my best to save my people, he said, water dripping down his chin, but I need you all to listen to me. To us, for the time being. I promise I'll do what I can to help you all. Cecilia was staring at him, an indescribable feeling of pride in her heart. It was the first time she was seeing Ashen interact with his people, with the common folk, and he was nothing like he was with the clan leaders and nobles. He was drenched, his shoulders low and cold, but he had never looked more magnificent in her eyes. This was the real Ashen, the Ashen who had grown up in the streets of Estera and fought to free them from his father's tyranny. In front of them, the crowd seemed at a loss of what to do, exchanging whispers between them and sending doubtful glances to their monarch. Cecilia stepped forward. We are bringing tea and food, she said in a loud voice, but no one will get anything if we can't distribute them. Please be patient a little bit longer. She glanced around to see if anyone was going to protest, but the mention of warm food and drinks sparked a light of hope in many eyes. The king himself had come, and the situation was looking much brighter now, so the crowd had ceased to protest for a short while. The rain itself wasn't going to kill these people. They were scared of drowning or getting sick. The solution to the second problem was on the way, but the first one was the priority for now. There was way too much water starting to flood the streets of the outer capital. Soon, not even the buildings would be safe, the water was going to start getting in. Cecilia looked around, trying to find a solution. The ground was slightly inclined toward the river and the edge where the walls had been erected. That was the main problem. Because the water couldn't be evacuated naturally, the whole area was turning into a reservoir. Cecilia frowned and turned to Ashen. "We have to tear down the wall." The king frowned, immediately conflicted. He didn't like the idea. Those walls had been built to prevent people from finding ways to cross over the bridge or cheat their way inside the capital. If they broke some of it, they might be opening a large breach into a lot more troubles later. He looked around. Sadly, right now, there was no other solution on the table. The water was rising fast, and all the people in front of them were in danger. Perhaps a couple more hours and the water would start swallowing people, and getting inside the buildings. They had to do something while they could, or there would be no way to calm the furious crowd, and that would be a much more pressing issue. His eyes met with those of the terrified children, clinging to their parents and crying loudly. He had once been as helpless as them. He had been scared of dying, of hunger, of the cold. He had been scared for his mother, and his younger brothers, and watched helplessly as they were taken away by disease. Ashen took a deep breath, and turned around, staring at the large closed doors. Taking down the wall, even a portion of it, would take too long, but they could win time before that. He glanced back at the crowd, and his dark eyes darkened. "I'm going to open the doors," he said, "but no one shall come in." Immediately, a concert of protests started loudly. People had been waiting for days, weeks, and even months for those doors to open for them and their families. Now, the king was going to open them, but they couldn't cross, even in such a situation. This was too much. The shouts at the king got louder, but Ashen wouldn't budge. He stared at the crowd, with his dark eyes, not afraid. Cecilia wasn't as confident. His popularity was already not what it once was, and now, it was almost a provocation to open those doors and trust these people not to force their way through. The only thing scarier than a natural disaster was an angry mob. Ashen was facing hundreds of people, and this time, no one could help him. This was not a situation that a dragon, brute force, or money could solve. Cecilia couldn't step in, either, which made her feel even more sorry for him. But those people were Ashen's people. She was still only a foreign princess. "You can't keep us here. We're all going to die," the angry crowd roared. "Let us through." "No," Ashen retorted, calm but loudly, "or do you people want another civil war?" Those last two words calmed them almost instantly. There wasn't a single person here who had forgotten the nightmare before the White King rose to his seat. Some were hesitant, or doubtful, the cold and anger making them lose part of their rationality, but many knew their current situation would come to pass if they waited, perhaps in a matter of hours. They all knew a civil war could last much, much longer than that. "There's really nothing ready to welcome you in the inner capital," Ashen continued, "but we are bringing the basic necessities to you. If you force your way in, not only will you not get anything, but people might die in meaningless fights." "Who says you'll help us?" someone shouted. "You've been keeping us out of the capital for so long." "I've been doing what I can," Ashen roared back. And I know it's not enough. But right now, this is what it is. I swear we'll do what we can and save everyone we can. I'll do anything I need to. The crowd hesitated, but before anyone could protest again, a large man made his way to the front. His large frame was intimidating, and he was standing half a head above everyone else, with a large beard and small eyes, which were riveted on the king. He was carrying a large axe too, although his apron seemed to indicate he was some sort of blacksmith, not a fighter. He stepped forward, detaching himself from the crowd to face Ashen, his bushy eyebrows knitted together. I remember a boy who once stood with us, he said, his loud voice reaching everyone. Back then, there was a bad king in this castle and war everywhere. My family was scared, like everyone. I lost 2 brothers, my sisters-in-law, and 4 of my nephews and nieces to that bad king. Not many people were brave enough to fight the king's soldiers, but there was a boy who did. That boy was brave as any man I've met. He was standing, tall as a mountain, and staring very seriously at Ashen. From the odd accent in his voice and the strange hairdo with feathers braided in his hair, Cecilia suspected he belonged to one of the smaller families. He had a few people standing behind him and glancing at him as if he was their leader of some sort, and a young girl was standing behind his leg. In fact, as her eyes kept going around, Cecilia noticed several more groups of people who seemed to have similar distinctive traits from the others. Some of them had tattoos of little black dots and lines on their bodies, including their faces, or scarifying marks. Others had unique hairstyles or unique kinds of jewelry. So many people belonged to families she hadn't heard of before. "Is there anything left of that boy we trusted?" asked the man. "I won't follow a greedy and cruel king. But I will listen to that boy once more." Cecilia turned her eyes to Ashen. He looked a bit surprised to be reminded of his past in such a way, but after all, it hadn't been so long for those people since the seemingly dead prince had come back to take his tyrant father down from the Eastern Kingdom's throne. For those people, the memories of his battles and honesty were still fresh enough to give him the benefit of the doubt, and thanks to that bearded man, even those who had forgotten were now reminded of this. Ashen took a deep breath and stepped back, not away from the man, but closer to the doors. "I am that boy. And I am your king. Now, whether you agree with me or not." He turned around and began pushing the doors. Those doors were large and heavy. They normally took a whole mechanism to be opened, and at least 1 man for each door. Yet, the king only had 1 hand pushing against each door. They saw him use all of his core, arm, and back muscles, struggle for half a second, and slowly, he opened the large doors. As predicted, the water went flowing out through the bridge's arches, decreasing on the side they were standing on. Cecilia turned to the people, all stunned by the king's strength and bearing. She felt a little bit proud. Despite the situation, those people admired Ashen. Indeed, they knew what he had once done for this kingdom, and weren't ready quite yet to mob against him. Once the doors were opened, Ashen turned around, his chest going up and down with his heavy breathing. He stared at the crowd as if daring them to defy him. However, nobody moved. Many people had their eyes riveted on the bridge, but the anger from earlier had definitely been subdued. Instead, after a couple of seconds, some of those eyes lit up. "Look, exclaimed a young man. From the other end of the bridge, people were advancing, heading toward this side. Cecilia ran to Ashen's side, and quickly found relief. The Duro-Safe tribe. She recognized a few of Nana's cousins, who were braving the downpour to pull a large cart. Soon enough, they arrived, drenched, but looking around. The young woman she recognized from the fish market ran to them first. "Lady Cecilia! Your Majesty! We brought a lot of food. As much as we could prepare for now, but there is more coming. And we have ingredients to prepare more here too." "Thank you so much," said Cecilia, relieved. "Let's get you set up as soon as possible." Food. The little voice behind could have come from anyone, but the dozens of hungry eyes riveted on the cart meant the same thing: those people were starving. Cecilia was suddenly worried. Were they going to try and force their way to the cart now? She took a deep breath and stood in front of the cart. "Yes. The Duro-Safe tribe brought food, but please, be patient. We will find a way to distribute it to everyone." A few people ignored her and suddenly rushed toward the cart. Cecilia stepped back, panicking about what to do to stop all those people, but before she could even react, an axe suddenly swung through the air, brutally slamming into the ground. "Stop it!" roared the man from earlier. "Didn't you hear the lady? They will distribute the food. And there's more coming. If you rush now, how many kids will starve because of you, greedy? By the Galatian tribe, if anyone else touches that cart, I'll slice your greedy hands myself." Even the young girl by his side glared around as if to dare anyone to approach. His people were clearly siding with him, and now, the crowd didn't dare come closer, instead looking like they actually felt a bit guilty for rushing. "We will be ready soon," Cecilia promised. She exchanged a quick glance with Ashen, who was still standing a few steps back in front of the doors. He nodded and crossed his arms. He wouldn't move from there, to prevent the mob from trying to force their way into the capital. The tall man sighed and turned to Cecilia. She was tall, but that man looked like a giant compared to most people. He brushed his hair. "Come on, young lady, you should get all this to where we can distribute it soon. Words can't hold hungry stomachs for long, and to be honest, everyone's been starving for a while." "I will. Thank you." Not hesitating anymore, Cecilia quickly moved, guiding the people from the Duro-Safe tribe to meet Nana at the first inn, just like Tessandra had said. Plus, her cousin was there, and they had found a tent large and strong enough to erect outside. Quickly, they had the Duro-Safe people borrow the inn's kitchen and start making more buns, while Tessandra, Sabael, and Cecilia put the tent up outside, as close to the doors as they could while staying close to the inn. The crowd was now completely disinterested in the doors, glancing with hungry eyes at the large beignet that quickly appeared in their little stall. "Everyone, get in line," roared Ashen. "Families with children or pregnant women first."